PFARRER, co-produced by Alan Brewer, and simulcast on this Memorial Day weekend in the United States, simulcast on Twitter with Volya Radio. So this broadcast is going out globally, when you stop and think of it, globally live, both from YouTube and from Twitter. And it is so fitting that it happens to be Indications and Warnings 100th episode. We're going to be joined with our great friend WarDoggo and others live from Ukraine. And it's also fitting because Chuck and I are here the day after a horrendous Russian attack on Ukraine, focused on Kyiv. Just let me remind our viewers and listeners, this actually is the attack that Vladimir Putin promised Donald Trump not to launch if only he could hold his parade in Moscow. That's how I see it, Chuck.
Well, like every Russian promise, you pretty much get what you pay for. I think there's some video clips going on that just absolutely perfectly lay plain what Putin's war is all about. And I am thinking of the Oshiric ballistic missile systems. They are truly a weapon of nuclear war. These were loaded with, they're actually unarmed. But the horrendous video shows as this Oshiric goes up into low orbit, it comes down ballistically, aimed at the city of Kyiv, aimed at a particular neighborhood in Kyiv, where almost dozens of multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles and their decoys. So almost a score of projectiles traveling at Mach 20 or 25, slamming into one city block, randomly selected in a civilian neighborhood of Kyiv. And if you want to know what the Russian war is all about, that is what it's about.
Well, it is about that, Chuck. And, you know, I also want to welcome our friend WarDoggo here, want to say hello to mockers. Gerza is going to be joining us. And let's just go to mockers for a moment and then to WarDoggo. I have, I think, 6 windows open now.
Mission control. Mockers, hello. WarDoggo, hello. It's so good to hear you. You're still right here in my heart, as Pure Prairie League says.
And WarDoggo, you're with us too, I think.
Thank you so much for today's opportunity to meet all together. You cannot argue with the word simultaneously, and that's exactly how our today's meeting is happening, both Twitter space and YouTube. And thank you so much for this amazing opportunity to speak in the surrounding in the group of friends who support Ukraine, and being able to do something that we were doing for already 5 years of the full-scale invasion, and many in Ukraine do since the war has started in 2014, supporting those who hold peaceful Ukrainian skies. And as we already know these days, it's also related to defense of Europe, defense of freedom, defense of democracy. And there are many who sacrificed the most pressures by prioritizing something that even more important than the life is is freedom, prioritizing freedom, and that's in front of the Memorial Day tomorrow in the United States. We are doing today's discussion, today's interview, today's meeting, commemorating everyone who gave the most pressures so we could live our lives, we could have the discussions like we are having today, and being part of the free world when the axis of evil is doing its best to take this from those who deserve to be free. Back to you, dears. I see we already have Gerza with us.
Yes, we do. Gerza, welcome, and please go ahead. And I do want to remind everyone, listeners here on Volya Radio, viewers on YouTube, one of our goals here today is to raise money for Alpha SBU. If you are on Twitter, you can find a link to Give Butter right up in the only tweet in the nest right now. If you're watching on YouTube, there is a link in the video description, and I'll be sure that a live link also somehow gets into the chat panel over on YouTube. But we're going to be talking with WarDoggo and Gerza. I don't know if others from Alpha are going to join us or not, but we're going to be talking about urgent needs, and we're going to be helping as much as we possibly can get those needs supplied to the front line. So it's EW, it's tactical gear. WarDoggo, Gerza, lead me through this fundraiser right now.
Yes, absolutely. You know, probably much better than me already. As soon as you guys do amazing job in sharing the context behind the war that Russia have launched in Ukraine against the free people of Ukraine, unprovoked, brutal aggression that takes lives of the bravest daily, and those who hold the line, those who hold the peaceful skies of Ukraine 24/7, without weekends, without holidays, without pause for victory parade, or as they call it, as we call it, what Russia does, victory madness, or победобесие, as we call it in Ukraine, because there is nothing left than just to make crazy obsession about the past that leaves nothing more in the future. So those who hold the skies in Ukraine, you know, the intensive combat, it is an intensive, quite sophisticated technologically. Combat war in Ukraine requires not only dedication, not only effort, but also lots of specific instruments. And as we are having today the discussion with guys from Center of the Special Operations A, or as we also call Alpha SBU, guys are doing the top of the age work, very specific. That is, before the war was counterterrorism and all the operative work that and special force work within the security service of Ukraine. Today is the full-scale war, and the requirements are according, in the sense of year replacement. The technological warfare brings the requirement of anti-drone specific means.
Well, WarDoggo, I want to break in for just a moment.
Intensity of the combat requires that this is something. Absolutely.
And we will be going to the front line with Gerza and your needs. But you know, it's interesting, just at this moment, as we are turning our focus to the front lines, I have a question coming in from a listener from Denmark. Is the Hawk missile going to stop Russia? So Chuck, the Hawk missile air defense system, $108 million sale, has been approved from the United States to Ukraine. That actually is a frontline system. It would not do much to defend Ukrainian cities.
No, it really wouldn't. It is a short range or point defense system. It was actually America's forward deployed missile system, again, short range air defense system, point defense. It was extremely mobile. The batteries could literally be towed behind a Jeep. Their sensors and command units as well were highly mobile. It's a little long in the tooth. It's no longer forward deployed by the United States. However, we have hundreds of these systems available. They are in mothballs. Look, I want Ukraine to have everything it possibly needs, and especially air defense. But $107 million is only a handful of these batteries. Although it's a capable system, it was primarily designed to intercept attack helicopters and also close enemy attempts at close air support. These systems were designed to protect frontline units and their ground lines of communication and supply. Unfortunately, Russia's penchant for attacking civilian targets and Ukrainian cities means that these highly mobile platforms are, placed in Ukrainian cities in a role they're not really designed for. However, they're good at shooting down Shaheds. But the air defense engagements envelopes are extremely complex, and they normally deal with the hundreds of incoming Shahid drones, and they are augmented at the end of their attacks after they've depleted much of the Ukraine's air defense projectiles, etc. In come the ballistic missiles. So that's a very long answer. That although Hawk is good, it isn't going to really put its finger on the balance here too much, Alan.
And as a point defense system, there are a lot of points on the front line that need defense. And this is, I think, now WarDoggo and Gerza can help us understand better the conditions on the front line. And also for viewers and listeners to remember, there is no defined front line anymore when you come right down to it. It's not trench warfare as it was as the winter of 2022 and 2023 unfolded. It's not trench warfare like World War I. And when I say the front line isn't really defined, in a way, the Russian terror attacks on Ukrainian cities show that the front line is not defined. Every city in Ukraine is a front line city, but on the front line itself, you have Ukrainian units within a 20-kilometer wide or even 30-kilometer wide kill zone, and right in the middle, that is, I guess, WarDoggo, Gerza, where you are at most danger and where the kill zone is most saturated with drones. Is that right?
Just mentioning this, bringing this quick, and then we're also involving our tonight's guest. Yes, drones made the operative, tactical, and strategic levels, as you understand from the FPVs, mid-range, long range, quite this difference in between the operative, tactical, and strategic level quite blurry, in the sense of tactical becomes tactical, operative tactical becomes in between, and so far and so on. But I would like to say good evening to our guest. Gurza, добрый вечер, good evening. Hope you're doing well. Let us know how you're doing.
Good evening to everyone, or it's better to say good afternoon. Thank you everyone who joined our Volya broadcast. And still, I'm very grateful to all who are not indifferent to Ukraine, and especially to my unit and to all guys who keep rank and fight for Ukraine against Russian terror and Russian invaders.
Speaking about the front line, as Alan and Chuck were just briefly discussing, we hear each other on more or less monthly basis online, and every time the question is the same: how different now the combat environment is, as we discussed since the previous time. How you see the front line evolving, and what today's frontline looks like, just to contribute the specific discussion and specific point that Alan and Chuck were mentioning, because of how modern frontline, how today's frontline look like.
About frontline, so I want to add that Russians, they used cruise missiles and bombs to destroy positions and just to erase each building or each position at the front line. They use a great number of cruise missiles, and it's almost impossible to fight against cruise bombs because we don't have such FPV or anti-missile devices.
Absolutely. Speaking about the FPVs, and speaking about not only the first-person view drones, but speaking about all type of air defense drones, as we call them in Ukraine, because speaking about the recent attack, a recent Russian attack on Kyiv, and Kyiv data in particular, that's already the data from the open media. If several months ago, let's call it half year ago, the part of the air defense drones, those drones that are targeting Shahid, attacking Russian Iranian attacking Shahid drones, if they're those that are targeting, chasing, and eliminating in the air those drones, if the percentage of the drone used as the air defense was like 30%, in defense of Kyiv, for instance, these days 50% is the actual number of the drones that are used to protect the cities like Kyiv, and that's the share of the modern warfare. Yes, but unfortunately, we don't have yet the drone that could take off the KAB gliding bomb that Russia are using, the Second World War era bombs that they have modernized to the gliding mechanisms that are launched not only towards the city across the front line, but also across the positions in the front line, that actually makes quite a lot of a trouble, if I may so. Correct? Back to you, Gurza.
Yes, absolutely right. And of course, we have enough groups and units who fight and using drone interceptors. We use against such drones as Shaheds, Gerberas, Molnias, Russian type of drones. But of course, we don't have such drones to intercept cruise missiles, and gliding bombs, or ballistics.
If I can come in for a second, it's Chuck. Hi. We were just getting into the Hawk missile batteries, which are defending Ukrainian cities, pressed into service there. But it would be precisely the system, if it were deployed to the front line, that could deal with larger Russian strike drones and even Russian guided bombs. So this is another example, despite, in addition to the sheer terror that Russia wishes to sow, by attacking Ukrainian cities, they force every air defense system to come to the protection of Ukrainian civilians, which means Ukrainian command has to select who to defend. And their choices are either the frontline soldiers or the women and children literally in their beds at night. So it is a very bad choice. And I'll just go on just a little bit to kind of give a blow-by-blow last night of what interceptions did work in this massive attack. So there were approximately 600 Russian murder drones that were launched. I'll point out every one of these was targeted on residential areas throughout Ukraine. Every one of these. So 600 were launched and 549 were intercepted or diverted by electronic warfare. That's a pretty good ratio of 91%. However, the 9% that got through, they were hitting apartment buildings. Of the cruise missiles that came in, KH-101s, Iskanders and Caliber, the Russians fired 54 of those. 44 were intercepted or diverted. That's a pretty good number of 81%, but that means 20 of those cruise missiles, or in this case, 10 of those cruise missiles, again, hit apartment buildings. I'll go through this really quickly. Iskander Ms and S-400s. And the S-400 is an anti-aircraft missile, but the Russians are happy to shoot anything that could hit a playground. They fired 30 of those, and only 11 were intercepted. That's only 37%. Of the Kinzhals, this is a very fast-moving hypersonic missile. They fired 2. Both of them got through. Zircon, which is another high-speed missile, they fired 3. None of those got through. And they fired Oreshnik, and they fired 1 of those, and it got through. And Alan, as I just went through those were literally the order in which they were fired. 600, Shaheds, and then the rest of them. So this is an overall rate of 88%, which is good, Alan, but the 20% that's getting through.
Well, listeners and viewers should not mistake this Russian attack for what the media so often calls a retaliatory Russian attack. There are no retaliatory Russian attacks. This is a terror attack on Kyiv. It is, as I said at the top of the show, the very attack on Kyiv that Putin promised Donald Trump he would not make if he was allowed to hold his parade in Red Square on May 9th. So these are some of the buildings in Kyiv that were hit overnight, including government buildings, the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Its windows were blown out by the blast, and there was other damage to the building. A devastating loss is the almost total destruction of the Chernobyl Museum, which has been open for less than a month in Kyiv, and in commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl. And one thing this museum helped visitors understand is who bears the responsibility for that disaster. It is the Russians who both designed the Chernobyl reactor and operated it with some Ukrainian help. The Institute for Religious Studies was struck. The Opera and Ballet Theater building was struck. The Tax Authority building. The Kyiv School of Economics was hit for the very first time in over 4 years of strikes on Kyiv. a supermarket, and a very old market outside the Lukyanivska metro station was also struck. Schools were struck. All those high-rise residential buildings and water supply infrastructure was struck. And I would remind listeners and viewers, when you look at the recovery efforts underway in Kyiv, especially around the high-rise residential buildings, essentially this is like a 9/11 every single day in Kyiv. Every time after these Russian strikes, it takes it takes individuals to crawl through the rubble, but it takes lots of power machinery, lots of high-rise cranes to locate survivors in this rubble. So, Chuck, I don't think it is going too far to say it's like a 9/11 rescue operation.
No, not at all. And I stand corrected on my targeting, folks. I left out the museums, the churches, the universities, the graduate schools. Again, and there is no military or moral equivalency between Russian targeting and Ukrainian targeting. You are never going to hear the story of Ukraine firing a ballistic missile at Moscow. That hasn't happened. Ukraine, frankly, doesn't have the offensive weapons to squander them on terror attacks. So this, to ever even call this a retaliatory strike by Russia is absolutely preposterous. Because what Ukraine does devote its resources to, Alan, is to hitting cogent military targets within Russia.
And we have some questions coming up about that, but I do want to go back to WarDoggo here, Chuck.
Please do.
Thank you, Alan. One of the, let's say, main confirmation that you can always consider when such strikes like this night Russia have conducted, like many other nights. This is kind of the complex operation in order to prepare, in a sense of it takes, from, I believe Gerza can correct me, from his perspective of the security service of Ukraine and the intelligence that security service of Ukraine does with GUR, but overall such operation requires weeks in preparation, and those weeks are not two, and it means all the logistics to deliver the missiles, to deliver the projectiles overall, and to prepare. And considering also Russia's size as a country, it takes most probably not less than several weeks to prepare such an attack. So it's not the retaliation, as sometimes is it called, but it has been prepared right straight in the moment when they were asking for a ceasefire for the 9 May parade, as they call it, victory parade. But Gerza, what do you think about the Russia's last night attack, and specifically preparations that it could take a country for such such operation?
About Russia, so you're absolutely right, WarDoggo. So it can take from 1 to several weeks to prepare such massive attack using Shaheds and missiles of different types and range to and I want to say that they use such word as C sign, or to short period, to say that they want a peace, but they take this time to prepare for massive attack. And the same, I want to say, it is about Frontline. It was time during Easter Easter period. They claimed peace period, but when we want to change guys' positions, our pickups were hit by Russian FPV drones. So it is not about Russia, because Russia, it is full about terror and everything about lie.
Exactly, and absolutely. Recalling back to, I don't know, 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 300 years ago. Let's switch back 10 years ago, 11 years ago, 2015, Donetsk Airport, Prokofiev Airport of Donetsk, as it was called, and the heroic defense of Donetsk Airport, when every centimeter of the ground around the Donetsk airport has been already under fire control of Ukrainian artillery, and every Russian moving behind the bushes was immediately through the well-coordinated defense and the fire control was giving the incoming rounds from Ukrainian artillery. And immediately when Russians started the attacks, they got smashed. Of course, they were asking for this operative ceasefire to collect the fallen occupants. And immediately when they got the ceasefire, when they got the positions when their fallen were located, they, instead of taking the fallen from the battleground, they were fortifying the positions just in the place they got to. That's actually, if you scale it to a level of the country, that's actually the Russian tactics that has never changed 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 300 years ago, and that's who our enemy is. Back to you, Alan. Back to you, Chuck.
Thank you. And I do, again, just want to ask viewers at YouTube, listeners here on Twitter at Volya Radio, please do look for the live links that you can get to give butter and make a contribution to Alpha SBU for what they urgently need. EW gear, that's electronic warfare, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, and some tactical gear. We'll be talking about that as well. I especially want to remind our American listeners, this is Memorial Day weekend. In the old days, when I was growing up, Memorial Day was not only a day off, not only a day for barbecues. It was an almost sacred day when my father and others from a very, very small town in Maine, fewer than 4,000 people at that time, they would find a way to get into their World War II uniforms and march down Main Street. And always, I was in the crowd, of course, but always the parade ended at the town pier and a wreath was thrown into the harbor to commemorate those who gave their lives at sea. Every cemetery in the United States was adorned with American flags and with plaques memorializing those who had fought and protected freedom, some in World War II, many in the First World War, some going as far back as the Spanish-American War and the Civil War. The state of Maine is famous for the 20th Maine regiment that fought at Gettysburg, and many, many Maine families count among their ancestors those who fought in the Civil War. Remember that Memorial Day weekend means something. You can make it mean even more this Memorial Day weekend by giving to Ukraine, by giving to Alpha SBU, because they are the ones fighting today to protect freedoms and to protect democratic values that Americans and Europeans and others have fought for so long. So click on those links up in the nest in Twitter, in the chat over at YouTube on indications and warnings. And we'll be getting to questions that are coming up from indications and warnings on YouTube. But I also want to go back, Chuck, to WarDoggo and Gerza and talk in particular about the Russian glide bombs, the CABs. Russia is using these massive bombs to flatten Ukrainian cities like Kostyantynivka, but they also use them on the front line. What is the experience of Ukrainian soldiers on the front line under this bombardment with these massive glide bombs?
Well, just first and the foremost, and I'll let Gerza to bring in more on that. First and the foremost, for those listeners who will be listening this episode in record audio or via YouTube, the donation link, simple as that, givebutter.com/proactive, and that's how you get to the fundraiser page, which we were discussing earlier. And contributions could be one time or monthly, setting up the regular support that could help the constant needs of Alpha SBU. And guys, we are supporting regularly since years and years. On the glide bombs, look, it's simple as that. If there is anything interesting that the observation surveillance drone have operator through the surveillance drone has noticed in your position, I don't know, the specific antenna, the specific equipment or transport, immediately 2 or even 3 KABs might be approaching your direction immediately within the red or even yellow area of the front lines. Electronic warfare, specific equipment, anything that makes significant interest of Russian occupiers, that's a big problem. But Gerza, what's your take on the KABs and its problem that it causes, and any specifics that you could integrate?
Gliding bombs is the main problem for FPV pilots and FPV operators, because if enemy's drone notice the position of Ukrainian FPV operators or position of FPV interceptors, so it's the main target for Russian gliding bombs. They can use for one position to destroy absolutely destroy this position. They can use from 5 to 10 gliding bombs, just to erase everything and to prevent our pilots to fly and using this position. So it's almost impossible to fight and struggle against gliding bombs. Even electronic warfare, it doesn't help, because they raise each house, each shelter we use to equip our positions.
Gerza, I'm wondering, the Ukrainians are working on extending the range of drones, everything from FPV drones to reconnaissance drones to heavy lift drones. Is that helping protect the drone teams on the Ukrainian side, that the range is now increased to an extent that they can take positions farther behind the most dangerous parts of the kill zone?
Sometimes we have to come closer to fly deeper and to make strikes deeper, because the closer you come, the deeper you can fly.
And the deeper you can fly means that you can concentrate on Russian logistics, right?
Yes, absolutely right. Russian logistics, and also the points on the place where Russian infantry collects.
Well, that is something, Chuck, that you often speak about, that the Russians cannot assemble these forces the way they might want to, especially there were some examples outside both Kostyantynivka and Pokrovsk where the Russians attempted to put together some mechanized units to attack, and the Ukrainians identified those assembly points and destroyed them.
Yes, and Gerza was just speaking about, how critical intelligence is, tactical intelligence, meaning what's going on adjacent to the zero line. And as Gerza just mentioned, that ability to observe and essentially predict enemy movements, it works both ways. As we just heard Gerza saying, when the Russians see something, the Russians still have an advantage in tactical aviation, what the Russians call frontal aviation. So this is fixed wing, primarily platforms that are delivering these KAB bombs. Ukraine does not necessarily have the resources to put a lot of its own fixed wing aircraft to address targets adjacent to the zero line. However, the exception to that is in areas like Kherson, where recently and ongoing, Ukraine has been able to deploy its own glide bombs against Russian targets. They're stacked in their importance and how lucrative these targets are, with a leading one being when Ukraine can identify a Russian drone control point and also points of command and control. But Gerza, we really do want to hear from you. One thing that Alan and I have reported on this week, in several places in Kostyantynivka and also in Pokrovsk, on 2 occasions, the Russians tried to put together a larger force of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, but especially at the one that Alan reported on from Kostyantynivka, the Ukrainians were able to attack with wave after wave after wave of FPV drones, and it very shortly destroyed this Russian column. But I wonder if you could talk to us again about what the Americans call the kill chain, which is see the enemy, gather your resources, and strike. And I know you can't talk too much about that, but we'd really like to hear what you have to say.
I want to mention also about their gliding bombs that they developed them and modernized, and now they can reach targets or our positions from the point of launch up from 50 to 70 miles. It's about from up to 100 kilometers. And they also cut our logistics with FPV drones and also with optic fiber FPV drones. They made a huge amount.
Yeah, there's this cat and mouse game going on constantly. We've seen the Russians' ability. They started this war with a certain amount of resources and a skill set, and that was to conduct, what used to be the standard of land warfare, which was combined arms maneuver warfare, tanks, artillery, air, all working together to support, mechanized maneuver elements, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, and Russia's principal infantry strength, which was the motor rifle troops. But the Russians have lost more than 11,000 tanks. They've lost somewhere between 20 and 30,000 infantry fighting vehicles. Every 10 days on the battlefield, they lose an entire division, right? 10,000 people. They lose 2 battalions every day. But when we see Gurza, it does seem that when they try to, as they did this morning and the day before, rather, in Pokrovsk, they put together several tanks, 15 infantry fighting vehicles, lots of motorcycles, but they get detected pretty early. And this is still an asymmetrical fight. There are about 100,000 Russian troops around Pokrovsk, and there aren't nearly as many Ukrainians. So Ukraine has to fight smart, doesn't it, instead of hard?
I want to mention, also add that war tactics is absolutely different from 2022, from 2023, and even from 2024. Right now, they used small groups to get to our positions using electric bikes or buggies. They don't use because they don't have such enough tanks, infantry tanks, as it was several years ago. Back to you.
Well, Gurza, I'm especially interested in these small group infiltration tactics that the Russians now rely on primarily. They also look for foggy weather or stormy weather, just bad weather that can give them a little bit more concealment as they try to advance. And this also means that Ukrainian drones might not be up over the routes that Russians are taking or trying to take through Ukrainian lines.
Yes, absolutely right. They widely use bad foggy weather when it is mist. So they try to get closer to our positions because it's quite easy because we are blind, especially when it is too foggy.
Well, this is where artillery actually plays a role, doesn't it? You know, there's been so much talk that drones will replace artillery. You can fire artillery on rainy days. Maybe you can't fly a drone on a rainy day.
Absolutely right, because FPV drones can reach target more deeper, flying across Frontline than artillery. And of course, the cost of one shot of artillery is expensive than even 10 FPV drones.
Yeah, we've watched a lot of that happen, and the integration of, you know, in my day, you needed a forward observer, or if you were really Gucci, you had an overhead platform to help you adjust your artillery fire. And of course, now that is done with drones, and you know that has sort of democratized aviation. Right, so every rifle squad can put something up in the air that has a combined reconnaissance and strike function, which brings me to my next question I'd like to ask you, Gurza, regarding electronic warfare. So, you know, and I've mentioned this very often, in my day, it was carrier battle groups that had electronic warfare. It was very large formations above the division level in land warfare. And now it's necessary even for a rifle squad, and almost especially for a small unit on the front line, to have an electronic warfare capability to at least warn them that enemy drones are in the area. And if you are really lucky, you have a system that also prevents the hostile drones from targeting you. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how important that capability is to individual small Ukrainian units who are operating close to the enemy.
Yes, I think it's not a secret, even for Russians, that we use small devices and like Chuika and other devices like that. They intercept a picture of enemy FPV drones, but only if it is analog video, but not cipher video. So you can be warned that nearby you there is an enemy FPV drone.
Yeah, and we saw a video recently that Alan and I commented on. There was a Ukrainian unit in a vehicle moving fast towards the front, and they actually had, just as you said, they were able to intercept local Russian drone video, and they happened to notice that there was a white truck going fast, pulling a dust trail, and they realized it was them that they were looking at in the video feed. They were able to stop very quickly and get out of the vehicle, and that literally saved their lives.
Yes, absolutely right. There are several types of these devices we use, and different and other units also use, just to be warned and to see beforehand if you notice that you have a picture. It is a device with a small monitor, and it intercepts enemy's video. So it's, if you notice that this area you are, so you can just leave a pickup or just to hide, find a shelter, not to be hit by enemy FPV drone.
Well, I wouldn't want to ever see that picture, Alan. I don't think I'd want to see that.
No. I just want to remind listeners at Volya Radio on Twitter, more than welcome to come up as speaker and ask a question. And we do have some questions coming in from YouTube. But I also want to go to my co-host on Volya Radio, Mockers. You've been so patient listening. I have only, as I said, 8 windows open, and the breeze, of course, blows in one ear and out the other.
Well, I did want to add something a little bit. That I spoke to some soldiers the other day, and they specifically spoke about these cab bombs that, you know, Russians don't even need to come near you now. They can just destroy a place from a distance with these cab bombs. And then when it's completely flattened, then they move in and they, you know, pretend, oh, look, we've liberated this place. So I understand what Gerza is saying here, that, you know, these are something which they can't do an awful lot about right now. And that is something that is really, you know, to counter that, you need to take out the Archer, not the Arrow. And that means taking out the aircraft. And, you know, it's something that we still don't really seem to be able to give Ukraine the capability to do so. And so they're still having to develop these capabilities themselves. Folks, about this experience here that we're having right now, Gerza is kind enough to give us his time, even though he is probably in a place where he is genuinely under bombardment. And I can only say that, you know, from the comfort of my sofa, what can I do to help him and thank him for giving us his time? I can make a donation. And that donation is really easy to make. You go to givebutter.com/proactive, all one word, proactive. And that is WarDoggo's proactive campaign to raise funds to help with whatever the guys need. If the guys come to him and say, we need hearing protection, he'll get that. If they say we need some new boots, he'll get that. Combat pants, we have a joke ongoing about combat pants. But yes, anything they come to him with and they say, look, we desperately need this next, he can use this proactive money to get that. But not if he doesn't have any money in the fund. So, folks, please dig in your couch cushions, give generously. I just checked my bank while I was being quiet here because I thought, what's the best thing I can do right now? I can make a donation. And so I was able to find some money to do that with. You know, it doesn't have to be a lot, but always remember that Gerza is giving us his very precious time, which, you know, he could be killing Russians and, or at least, you know, fighting with Russians, shall we say, we'll put it gently. But we all know what it really means. You know, he could be doing his job and instead he's coming to talk to us. So we should recognise that. WarDoggo, you've had your hand up for a while. I'm so sorry. Go ahead, my darling.
No worries at all. Thank you so much. And this community effort in bringing what is needed to the guys at the front, that's several years ago, I would put it that way, when this community have brought the first quite sophisticated spectrum analyzers to 18th Brigade National Guard of Ukraine electronic warfare guys as the proof of concept that Andriy, one of our friends, Andriy Besonov, was doing. And this community is being raising the funds to bring a fancy, interesting devices that actually, since that moment, several years ago, became the standard solution. For instance, now Gerza mentioned Chuika, a small portable device that allows you to see what Russian drone operator sees. And that's exactly one of the things why I'm very grateful to this community who is able to enable those very important things, the proof of concepts. And this is exactly how it became mass when many people were looking for a solution for a problem, which was an FPV. And yes, we found something, we found with your help, something that was literally saving lots of life since then until this current moment, and will be in the future, because many of the specific things that were delivered thanks to those fundraisers that we were doing together still not 100% clear for the enemy how that works. That's the power of the community efforts in doing this proof of concepts. When first we bring something that is not widely available, then it becomes let's say the standard solution in the army, and National Guard of Ukraine shared with all Ukraine's defense forces how this technology works, explaining in detail in particular, and many producers start working to produce those counter drone analyzing the signal interceptors and bringing on your even small, bigger, wider, flat, rectangle, whatever screen, what actually Russian operator sees. That's one of the efforts, how it started, and that's a brilliant example how the things work. Back to you, Alan, back to you, Chuck. Yours.
Thank you, WarDoggo. It really is a brilliant example, probably the most brilliant example. So this is something that your donation can support. And just speaking for myself, I will make an additional donation today on Memorial Day weekend, I think in memory of both my mother and father who fought and had experience in the Second World War. I see so many listeners on Volya Radio that I recognize, but I also see some new names and faces down there. We've received lots of promises that I know people will fulfill their pledges after this simulcast concludes. But we're here to go for a good long time. The other thing I was going to mention, Chuck and Gerza and WarDoggo, the Ukrainian Air Force, as ragged as it is, made up of MiGs and some F-16s, some Mirages. The French have promised to deliver some more Mirages. Some F-16s might be on their way from some other NATO nations. The Swedes are sometime going to deliver Gripens, and Ukrainian pilots have already been trained on the Gripen jet from Sweden. But one of the Ukrainian Air Force's roles is to, if possible, take out these Russian Sukhois that are 35, 50 miles away before they launch those glide bombs.
Yeah, the thing about an air defense system, integrated air defense includes both ground-based air defense systems of various ranges, with perhaps the apex predator being the Patriot missile system, some shorter range but extremely capable systems. For example, the German-provided Iris-T, which thus far, Alan, has never missed a shot in this war, which is remarkable. Every time an Iris-T is fired at an incoming threat, it makes the hit. That's unmatched in technology. It is a shorter range system, but it and the NASAMS, the National and Norwegian Standard Air Defense System, which actually fires AMRAAM missiles from the ground, which is an air-to-air missile, but it's been reconfigured to work from the ground. These are also systems that could be at the front, and in a normal NATO setup, they would be. And that would be pushing those Russian aircraft that are slinging these KAB bombs. It would push them back. But as Gerza knows, and WarDoggo as well, and Alan, you and I have been there, we've seen the destruction that these bombs wrought on Ukrainian cities. And if you name a frontline contact point, Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar, Pokrovsk, Severodonetsk, they are pounded. And Konstantinivka, a beautiful city, which is probably being hit exactly even now as we speak. So again, Ukraine needs everything. It needs every Hawk missile battery systems it can get. It needs everything. But this is going to be an ongoing request. And again, so there we're talking about assets at the national level. And we are talking to Gerza right from the front line, folks, from SBU Alpha, probably at this point, one of the world's premier combat experienced special operations unit, and they have real needs and wants. And if you're wondering on this Memorial Day, what can I do? Well, you could do a little something right now. $5 is gonna add up and help. They need vehicles. They need, and as Bakers was just mentioning, we had a fundraiser for pants for the SBU guys. So their needs are great, and their requests, Alan, they're pretty modest.
Yes, they are modest. At least on my Twitter feed, Bakers, I think we've lost Gerza as a speaker. Is that what you see as well?
No, I still see him here.
Okay. Well, one thing I'm wondering, Gerza, from the front, do you regularly hear, or do you hear often enough news from your hometowns? Or, for example, did you hear about this horrible massive attack on Kyiv and across Ukraine last night? Well,
I think for the moment we've lost Gerza, considering the connection, knowing that the guys are at the front lines. He was Gerza was writing me back in the back channel that there are some connection problems, but overall, yes, I'm pretty sure that that's the media coverage, that if you are not on the position, on the mission, where the phones are not allowed, yes, then the information is spread quite fast and intensively. I get also the message in the back channel that we will have to release our guest because Gerza has some urgent things to do. So I'm also bringing Gerza probably for thank you, and I believe we will have to release the guest. I will be staying with you as it is more than to say these days, as long as it takes. Gerza, back to you.
Yes, about news from hometowns, of course, we keep in contact thanks to Starlink system. It makes our connection and communication very easy. And I want to thank you, to say thank you to everyone who shared its time and still is not indifferent to our problems. And of course, thank you everyone who shares every cent and to this broadcast. Glory to Ukraine and glory to those people who support Ukraine and our warriors. Thank you very much.
thank you, Gerza. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us. And I promise you, it will make a difference for so many people to be able to listen to you, to ask you questions. And yes, Slava Ukraini, Heroam Slava, absolutely.
Yes, and also adding up on what Gerza mentioned, yes, the modern connection, the sat cubes, the Starlinks, and many other things that make even in the harsh environment of combat, in quite intensive intensive environment that the war can bring, as you can imagine, still the connection is used for the coordination, is used for precision, for the communication, and just the rapid. I mean, just to give you an example, how that works in a complex, when, I don't know, there is the room which is full of TV on the wall that is casting the drone picture around the operative of level of situational awareness on the operative, or sometimes even tactical level, considering how the things are in the area of the responsibility of a certain command point. The moment since the specific program or an operator notices a potential target in that video, and online the specific softwares are running in order to help humans to analyze the potential targets, to check the video recordings and so far and so on. Since the moment that the target is being spotted till the moment the FPV is approaching the area is minutes to get in the area and to check or approach the target, destroying it. Drones using the specific connection types are delivering ammo, supplies, food, water, whatever the positions require in this modern combat environment. As one chief in command, during the interview said, and I want that to sink in, that everyone imagines that even so-called simple, quote unquote, in the mindset of many army generals, rescue or evacuation mission in this combat environment is planned as an assault mission, with the backup cover groups being planned with all of the attributes of the assault operation, just to bring your guys back from the positions from the front line where they are holding the line. I want that everyone to think in a sense of just simply to bring the guys back is equal to an small assault operation in order to do that. And that is how the connection, coordination, and in-time precision in the operation planning and in communication makes the difference. And that's how the information, situational awareness, but also the connectivity, connection plays the role. It's bringing back to your question how the guys know about the certain events. That's not a question if, but it's a question, let's say, how on a regular basis, and that's constant connection and knowing the things and all of that. Back to you.
You know, WarDoggo, I was talking with a frontline medic yesterday who was on Volya Radio. Mockers was with us at the same time. It's April Huguet. She made exactly the same point you are making, using precisely the same words to plan even a single wounded soldier's evacuation from the front line requires the same detail and intensity of planning as an assault from the front line on Russian positions. And she described, how it is done, getting the wounded soldier or soldiers farther back from the front line in a series of relays to a point where they can be picked up, or in some cases picked up by a ground drone, a ground robot designed specifically to evacuate wounded soldiers. Now, this is in part the reason why some Ukrainian soldiers, even wounded soldiers, find themselves on a frontline position for 120 or 140 days or even longer. And it's just remarkable. And that means, of course, that getting medical supplies to the front line, often by drone, sometimes by ground robot, sometimes by heavy lift drone, is so important. Those medical supplies are actually keeping soldiers alive. There is no evacuation golden hour, in other words, any longer, Chuck. Sometimes it's days, weeks, months.
No, and that golden hour doctrine in the United States and in NATO forces, it was all predicated on 20th century warfare, not 21st century warfare. And in order to get a helicopter to land close to your position to get your wounded out, that assumes a lot of things. Helicopters don't shoot down jet fighters, but it's quite the other way around. So that requires at least localized air dominance there to get your medevac in and out. But, and I'm very glad Averill talked about it. I'm glad WarDoggo brought it up as well. When you start a fight with the enemy, the bell doesn't ring at 3 minutes and you don't go to your corner and start all over again. The hardest thing to do is to persuade that guy to stop trying to kill you for a minute while you make some sort of adjustment. But never, here we are in the 21st century. War has changed in this Ukrainian conflict. That is what made warfare change. And now the closer you get to the zero line, it is literally, if you are not under concealment and cover as well, cover being the things that stops a bullet. Concealment is the hiding in the bushes, so you don't get shot at to begin with. But if you are in and around the zero line, within 5 or 6 kilometers, you are in imminent danger of getting hit by a drone that is moving somewhere between 60 and 120 miles an hour. So that means, right, in 1 minute, it can close a mile. When you go up to 120 miles an hour, that means 30 seconds, right? It's a mile away. You think of yourself driving down the freeway and it says your exit is 1 mile. You know, you light a cigarette, you change the radio station, 30 seconds, and it's on you, and you are getting powdered. And, and then it goes back, folks, and 20 kilometers, so 12 miles from the zero line, you can still find yourself being hunted from the sky. And, as Avril was saying, you've got a wounded guy on the battlefield. You've got to formulate those routes, right? Where are the covered avenues, the concealment that I can utilize to get this guy out? And the relationship of a wounded man on the battlefield, the entire armed doctrine of the United States, they went to the M-16 rifle for a very kind of brutal reason. It shot a very small 22 caliber bullet, basically 223. It was designed to wound people, not necessarily to kill them, because if you wound somebody, you take out 3 people, the wounded person and the 2 people it takes to tend that wounded guy. So to get your wounded out and into medical care is vitally important if you are an army like Ukraine. On the other side of the coin, folks, if a Russian soldier is wounded on the battlefield, the chances are he's going to die. He has less than a 50% chance of survival because his evacuation is not prioritized. There's no field medicine to speak of. And that is one of many reasons, in addition to the greater combat efficiency of Ukraine, is that more Russians are dying in this war than Ukrainians, Alan.
If you are a WarDoggo, is that you? Go ahead.
I was mentioning that if in the past the ratio, I mean, even 1 year ago, the ratio for Russian occupants was 1 to 3, meaning killed in action versus wounded. Now it's almost equal, considering the fact that the evacuation is quite complex. Not even the fact that they don't care about their own soldiers, but the capabilities that Ukraine have built in the tactical and operative level drones. It makes the logistic and evacuation supply routes almost impossible. What I was explaining about the evacuation being almost an assault mission, and if Ukraine does those assault missions to evacuate own wounded soldiers and using the drones, both the ground drones and the first-person view drones, in order to supply the positions, Russians do not bother much, and they just simply use more and more demand power in order to storm the positions. Back to you.
So, the other thing I was thinking, WarDoggo, if you are a Russian prisoner that's just been taken prisoner, but you are wounded, you're lucky in a way, because the Ukrainians will actually evacuate you. In exactly the same way that they evacuate wounded Ukrainian soldiers. Of course, the Ukrainian soldiers are a higher priority, but, you know, and this, quite frankly, might be the right time to mention it, Chuck. What will happen to a Ukrainian prisoner on the front line? We've already seen the Russians commit a war crime. They they murder in cold blood disarmed Ukrainian soldiers by order. It's not by, some derangement of a Russian soldier on the front line. It is by order. Ukrainians are doing completely the opposite. Every time anyone is evacuated from the front line, it is a risk because Russians also target those evacuation vehicles. Russians also target Ukrainian medics and clearly marked ambulances and medic vehicles on the front line. It is a completely different way to fight war, one with such brutality and cruelty, the Russians, and one with a compassion so deep it will bring tears to your eyes.
Yeah, and it isn't, just as Ellen was saying, it isn't an aberration. It isn't, a local crazy person, although the proportion of felons and mental patients in the Russian army is greater than you would expect in a normal population sample. Alan, it was just you and I reported 6 months ago on a series of Ukrainian ambulance and armored personnel carriers that were being deliberately attacked by the Russians. We have the photographic and the video evidence. But to turn up the obscenity just a little more, in Kherson, where the Russians and the Ukrainians share the Dnipro River as a dividing line, in the city of Kherson, they have routinely attacked every ambulance, civilian ambulance they could come upon, individual civilians as well. And it shows what the brutality in the Russian mind is completely counterproductive. Because if you are known to be executing your prisoners of war, you are compelling your adversaries to fight to the death. What is the point of throwing yourself on the tender mercy of a Russian, not even a commander, the first people you run into? Unfortunately, in the case of this war, they're likely to behead you. That happened in the last 2 weeks as well. So, in every war, you're going to have some hyperbole and you're going to vilify the enemy. There used to be in information warfare black propaganda where you would make up terrible things that the enemy has done or will do or is doing. And there's no reason to make up anything about the Russians, because whatever aberration of conduct you can think about, whatever war crime you can think about, they're doing it, including chemical warfare. I've reported 3 special reports for the Kyiv Post on the ongoing use of chemical weapons by the Russians and increasingly noxious substances. So they are routinely using World War I gases, not just riot agents, which are prohibited, but, ongoing chemical warfare. Folks, if you read about that on the BBC or NBC or MSLSD, please tell me, because no one else is reporting it. The UN has condemned it. There have been numerous United Nations reports, but, it continues. And these chemical weapons have on occasion been used against Ukrainian civilians, including, Alan, the attack on an elementary school, which was carried out by drones that dropped chloropectin on an elementary school.
Well, I also asked April about gas attacks. It so happens, Chuck, she has been in the East and wasn't talking to us from Kramatorsk, but recently has been in Kramatorsk. And so I asked her specifically about Yuri, the chief medical officer of the mechanized brigade that we met. And I asked April the same question I asked Yuri. Have you treated Ukrainian soldiers on the front line for gas attacks? And she said, yes, absolutely. And she mentioned mustard gas specifically as likely a kind of gas that the Russians use on the front line. And she went on to talk about the need of gas masks and of filters, pointed out that like so many things on the front line, once received, it cannot be used forever. A gas mask needs to be maintained and refitted with filters to be effective in future gas attacks, right, Chuck?
Yeah, absolutely. Your filters are one-time use items. If you are in a gas attack using that filter, it needs to be replaced. We'll just talk very briefly on the sort of different tiers of these chemical weapons. There are riot gases, tear gas. I won't go into there are a number of different formulations of anti-riot agents, which are sort of the entry-level chemical weapon. However, they are categorically prohibited and proscribed in warfare. You can use those tear gas grenades against college students, but you cannot use them on the battlefield. The moniker mustard gas really does not do credit to the horror of that munition. It is designed to get into your lungs. You cannot tell when you've first been exposed to it. It has a certain smell to it, but you wouldn't know. It will burn the alveoli in your lungs, so you will die of pneumonia later. You will have pulmonary edema and die. There have been cases. Our medical director Yuri explained to us there have been cases where Ukrainian soldiers have rapidly died after exposure to a chemical munition. Yuri told me that he believed this was organophosphate poisoning, and that class of chemicals include insecticides. However, folks, nerve gases were invented accidentally by German scientists who were trying to make bug spray. And so what he is saying in so many words, these guys were probably exposed to nerve agents on the battlefield. Again, why the world isn't lighting up with Russia uses nerve gas in Ukraine, it's a bit hard to understand. And Avril confirmed this, Alan, and Yuri as well. So we have two direct first-person confirmations, in this. Should be a world-shaking development, but it isn't when you have medics telling us that they routinely treat gas casualties on the battlefield.
And just before going back to WarDoggo, I want to use the example of an air filter in a gas mask as and we're not raising money for that today, but an example of something that cannot be used just once on the zero line. And that is why when you become a monthly donor through WarDoggo, what I would call a sustaining donor, it means that WarDoggo has a reliable stream of donations that he can plan with for the future. But I also want to take just a moment to thank, I'm not going to thank by name, I'm going to leave that up to Mockers if she thinks that's what we want to do, but donations are coming in. And I really want to thank everyone who is making donations large and small. There was one donation I saw that absolutely took my breath away. And this is the reason we are here today on Memorial Day Sunday in the United States. It's also the day after Ukraine's Day of Heroes. The heroes in Ukraine are not only the soldiers and not only the medics on the front line, they are the rail workers, they are the rescue workers throughout Ukraine. Those rescue workers often subjected to what are called double taps. The Russians will aim a weapon or a drone at a specific building in a Ukrainian city. You wait just long enough for the first responders to arrive and then send a second drone or second ballistic missile at the same site. But Macher's contributions are coming in, and I want to just go back to you and then over to WarDoggo.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody, and particularly to the absolutely gorgeous picture of the cat. Yes, thank you very much. You know who you are, and that means a lot. It really does. Thanks.
So,
Go ahead, WarDoggo.
WarDoggo,
Yes,
go ahead.
thanks
Yeah.
for everyone who is supporting the initiatives. Thanks for everyone who is helping to share the context about Ukraine. The discussion today is extremely interesting. We were also pleased to have today with us guys from Alpha SBU, the 10/7 group of Gurta. Guys are doing an amazing work in as part of the defense forces of Ukraine in all across the eastern front line of Ukraine, doing the specific work. If at the beginning of the war, with the lack of infantry, Ukraine being forced to use quite specific guys like Gurta, like his group, like many other special force representatives as kind of elite infantry. These days, with Ukraine holding the line that is more than 1,200 kilometers front line from the east to the south of Ukraine, the whole trouble that Russia have created, the special force guys of the security service of Ukraine, the Special Operations Center A, or how we call them, Alpha SBU, they are those who make your days better, much better, when you see Russian oil refineries burning. You see different Russian different specific locations in the far background that are of the strategic location, making the Russian economy to feel the burden and bringing the war back to the territory of aggressor and making the aggressor understanding the price. In the modern world, where evil has no power, in order to understand that those actions, like using the military as the, let's say, the violent continuation of their international politics, is something that is completely inappropriate and unfitting. And Ukraine does absolutely great job in recovering that justice with the support of many around the world who help and support Ukraine. Our initiative is not that huge like the governments could be supporting using the taxpayer money in order to support what is right. This fight in Ukraine that is making quite Goliath story, David versus Goliath, or a Bible story, good versus evil. But I'm super glad that we are in the community of friends that understand the necessity to support Ukraine, supporting Ukraine since many years in the past. And it's absolutely safe to say our help and support to many guys, including Alpha SBU, whom we had today, lining up through the years already through many things that have been delivered. And you cannot imagine how many lives that equipment that makes the multiplication of the skills and experience of those guys into the in the right moment when it is needed. You cannot imagine how that the effect it has made. I brought today an example of the signal interceptors from the enemy drones, how from the initiative the proof of concept, it become a standard solution, pocket size, different other options still working as soon as the enemy does not understand 100% how that technology works to a very deep level that makes it still be effective. Just a simple, let's say, initiative in a group of people and connected in the same environment of the same minds doing the great thing together. That actually how this works. That's simple as that. And I thank to everyone who already contributed. I thank to everyone who will be contributing here in this episode in the future, because this simple but very important things having a great matter. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Back to you, Alan. Back to you, Chuck. If our audience have any questions, or you've been preparing any material considering the events that recently were being happening, I will be glad to also participate in discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, WarDoggo. I do want to catch up on some questions that have come in to indications and warnings on YouTube, and they do lead the discussion back to Kyiv and what happened there yesterday, last night, in a way. So here's a question coming in from indications and warnings, Chuck. Is it possible to identify the launch sites, the launchers of the Oreshniks in particular, and deal with those? And just a word about the Oreshnik. This is that intermediate range ballistic missile, and I guess a so-called IRCBM that the Russians developed and designed to carry nuclear warheads. And this is what makes it a terror weapon whenever Russia uses it. They launched an Oreshnik against Lviv and an Oreshnik against Kyiv last night, but only as kinetic weapons, which is remarkable to me. That's a $30 million shot. It might as well be a stone that comes in from outer space, right?
That's exactly it. There is nothing normally in these, so think of a sort of conical shaped, sort of like an upside down ice cream cone. And within that are more upside down ice cream cones. So the nose cone comes off, and then all these cones come down. And you can find this video on X. You'll see last night what looked like these sort of elongated, glowing objects coming down on Kyiv. But when the video was cleaned up and you zoom in, those elongated light bars actually contained 4 or 5 individual dots. What they were is each one of those MIRVs has 4 or 5 decoys with it. If that were really a nuclear attack, one of those 5 would be a nuclear warhead. And for those of you who can see me on video, you can have a nuclear warhead. I'm holding my hands about shoulder length apart. That isn't very big. You can actually have a fission device fired by a 152 millimeter artillery shell. So that's about 1/2 times as long as a long cigarette, how wide it is. Okay, so there are no weapons in these things, but they are traveling so fast, Alan, that their kinetic energy is off the charts. But as Alan just mentioned, the Russians spent about $20 million to launch this thing from about 1,500 miles away. Let's see, the Oreshnik actually has a range of 5,000 kilometers. So that's the range. It's harder for Ukraine to get to that to those lengths, but it has attacked what was the former Oreshnik launch site. It actually did attack that. The other points of launch, for example, the Shaheds operate in something like a small moving truck. It actually is kind of like a dump truck. You put the lid up and it launches about 5 Shaheds out of one vehicle. Those are, of course, highly mobile. The other threat is missile corvettes in the Caspian Sea, in the Sea of Azov, less often in the Sea of Azov, but in the western, in the extreme eastern Black Sea, however. So it's again, as Macher said, you want to get to the archer, not the arrow, but Ukraine can't always do that. The thing about the Shaheds, though, they get intercepted at a rate in the high 80s to the mid 90s, and that's pretty good. But if you've got a 300-pound TNT equivalent warhead, that's pretty much going to do a pretty good job on an apartment building, or as Alan pointed out, a university library or a cathedral. So you really want to get that intercept rate up to 100, Alan, and not settle for 85 or 90.
Yeah. And looking at film from Kyiv overnight, and actually we were talking last night on Volya Radio with folks in Kyiv as the attack was ongoing. But watching film from Kyiv last night, I did see some Russian cruise missiles going over the domes and spires of St. Sophia's Cathedral in Kyiv. And, you know, your heart sinks to know that a missile could be aimed at St. Sophia's. How
beautiful that building was it was astounding. It's a treasure of Western architecture and art. Right. And that's
a treasure of Kievan culture, which we know is 1,000 years older than Muscovy. Look, Chuck, here are a couple more questions from indications and warnings, and WarDoggo is still with us and will stay with us, and we'll get back to a conversation about the front line and possibly take a look at some maps. Does Ukraine have access to satellite information from the USA, assuming the USA is still providing that info, as well as from other sources? And yes, Ukraine does have such satellite information that helps it in targeting, especially targeting Russia's oil refineries and pumping network and oil industry.
Yeah, Ukraine knew that the Oreshnik was coming because it was launched from a former Soviet space station called Kapustin Yar. Like all of these Russian wonder weapons, this isn't push the button and let it go. It took a week to get this thing ready to go. So Ukraine is, for the time being, receiving pretty an updated stream of NATO quality overhead imagery. That, of course, includes satellite imagery as well. But we know how fickle that source can be. One of the reasons that the Kursk incursion has largely, there are still Ukrainian forces operating in Kursk Oblast now, but their hold has been greatly reduced because Washington unilaterally decided to turn off the intel, which was pretty much the equivalent of giving Putin back what he had lost in Kursk Oblast. That, of course, and the sacrifice of approximately 6,000 of the 10,000 North Korean troops who were sent to fight in Kursk. And I'm happy to say, Alan, that among the 6,000 casualties were 2 Korean generals. So maybe you get another one of those skillets, golden skillets, to put on your uniform in Pyongyang. That'll look pretty good. Whether you get a golden skillet from Kim Jong-un, you'd be rocking it.
You know, those satellite photos, the high-resolution satellite photos that Ukraine uses both to prepare targeting and to verify that the attack has been successful. I looked at some of those high-res photos from Novorossiysk, the last remaining Russian naval port in the Black Sea. Ukraine's attack on Novorossiysk, both on the oil facility and on the Russian naval facility, pretty effective, wouldn't you say, Chuck?
Yeah, we have a secret listener who's tuning in right now somewhere on the banks of the Indian Ocean, and he, by Lord and Jiminy, is one of the best battle damage assessors of Russian oil refineries that we know of. So that's, getting battle damage assessment is pretty good. You get the height of the battle, you're duking it out, and you're very often left to puzzle over how much damage you did. But I think in these cases, what's amazing, Alan, so in the case of Novorossiysk, and to our Russian listening guests there, good luck cleaning up the oil in the harbor, and maybe you can salvage a couple of those ships sunk at pierside. But Ukraine is actually getting live video feeds from the target area. So as drones are closing in on the targets, they have a variety of targeting modalities, but one of them is real-time video. So they can be steered into the target using low-light video, thermal. They have inertial navigation systems as well. But the fact that Russia can't defend the last bastion that it has of its vaunted Black Sea flotilla, and Alan, they couldn't get any farther east if they wanted to, because they've simply run out of ocean to retreat to. And the next ocean over, or the next sea over, folks, the Caspian Sea, which is 450 miles east, they're sinking Russian patrol craft in the Caspian Sea as well.
It's just remarkable. I was going to say that if they moved the Black Sea fleet to the Caspian Sea, they'd have to rename it. While we have WarDoggo still with us, I want to speak a little bit about what is happening in occupied Ukraine. It's very difficult to get news out of occupied Ukraine, but something that is quite interesting could frankly become a game changer for the rest of the summer, and that is Ukraine bringing the M-14 highway that runs basically from Donetsk across much of occupied Ukraine and then turns left to Crimea. Ukraine is bringing a good part of the M-14 under fire control, and this is with FPV drones, obviously. But what I'm wondering, Chuck, because the M-14 also goes through Melitopol, which we've described as bandit country, would there be on-the-ground resources essential to Ukrainian targeting and to Ukraine knowing what's on the road when?
Yeah, that absolutely would be. And, we're raising money, of course, for the SBU Alpha units right now. This is a very diverse force with a lot of overlapping and complementary capabilities. One of them is to deeply insert special operations forces And one of the functions of that kind of unit is to develop local resistance networks. And we just saw the map that was up there showing, yes, there it is. Thank you, Thomas. The route from Rostov-on-Don through Mariupol, Melitopol, and down into Crimea. So there are only 3 ways in to Crimea. One at the bottom of your screen is across the Kirch Bridge. The one that we're looking at in red is the M-14 highway, and then there is the M-17 highway that comes in on the other side of the peninsula and goes pretty much to the same place, to Sevastopol and Simferopol. Okay, you can look at yourself and see what an absolute roundabout way this is. Why would the Russians go on this multi-hundred-mile truck journey when they could just drive across the Kirch Bridge? Well, they can't. The Kirch Bridge is still standing, but it is not a solid architectural artifact anymore. And driving this route through Mariupol and through Melitopol, especially when it gets into Melitopol, as Alan just said, this is bandit country. This is the place in the occupied territories, this and in the vicinity of Donetsk, where there are a lot of Ukrainian partisans, and they are operating along this stretch of highway. They are augmented by the SBU forces. Things like a longer distance drone can come into the vicinity of Melitopol, drop dozens of shorter range FPV drones, which are then used to attack trains, vehicles on the actual highway itself. We just saw some video this week of a Ukrainian FPV drone cruising up and down the M-14 highway. Nobody's stopping it, no one's shooting at it, and really no one even pointing at it. And it overflew dozens and dozens of civilian vehicles until it found a Russian truck under a tree. Pretty funny. It did a U-turn like Wile E. Coyote and came back and got it. So these are the lengths to which Russia has to go now with the Kirch Bridge out and its rail link essentially severed, that it has to go to supply the needs of the territory it's occupied in Crimea. And Alan, we reported this week, there is no more diesel fuel in Crimea. And diesel is the lifeblood of any military vehicle. And gasoline, if you can find it, is exorbitant. The next thing that's going to be short in supply, Alan, during this summer, and that's going to be water in Crimea, drinking water. So it's going to be a long, hot summer for the Russians.
Chuck, let's go to WarDoggo and talk a little bit about getting news from occupied Ukraine. It's not an easy thing to do, but I know a lot of Ukrainians who are refugees from Mariupol, for example, but might still have family in Mariupol. And they are posting things like Azov is back in Mariupol. And that, I think, raises the spirits both of people in occupied Ukraine and raises the spirits of folks who fled places like Mariupol and Donetsk City and Melitopol and Tokmak, so many other places in occupied Ukraine. WarDoggo?
Yes, absolutely. First and foremost, there are people who are waiting Ukraine to come. This is important element. That is why, despite Russian efforts, and I have to tell you, since the Soviet Union, KGB, Russia is very strong in oppressing the resistance since, I don't know, 1920s to 1940s and 50s. After the Second World War, they mastered the mechanism of repression and the whole process of suppressing the own society, and you see it already in the daily news, how they behave and what they do to their own society. But you can imagine what they do on the occupied territories by stories from Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, Izium, or any other small village or town where Russian stayed for more than 2 weeks. The mass graves and the whole, let's say, the process of discovering those tortured, murdered, and raped has been a part of standard operation procedure after Russians have left with the gesture of the goodwill the places I've been mentioning. For them, this horror, torture, and kind of this kind of behavior is just simply part of the military doctrine, how to suppress. This is exactly what was happening and is happening in the occupied territories. The enemy is trying to bring the facade, like this famous Potemkin village of the city being reconstructed, like Mariupol, but at the end, the locals always say that one block is reconstructed and built on the rubble and on the graves of those who are buried under those rubble. Those people who do not accept to receive the Russian passports, and those who fled the territory with the recent Russian law adopted are losing their property on the occupied territories, if that property still exists. Russians just bringing the families just from, I don't know, far east, from any far territory of Russia, just simply taking place such properties. So the murder, rape, and robbery, that's what's happening on the occupied territories, and Russia is conducting those rape and torture as part of their, I don't know, justified by law, and let's say supported by current Russian legislation that they have adopted to serve those purposes. And of course, people in the occupied territories, they who wait Ukraine to come, they are happy to hear that another part of the area Ukraine took under the fire control, and Russia is one step closer to another gesture of the goodwill. And by the way, recently, Russian occupying administration of south of Ukraine have limited the passage of the transport through Jankoy to exactly because of this highway between Donetsk, Mariupol, and connecting Crimea that is under fire control. They have limited the transport that is allowed to move only to the military transport. What does it mean? That they have even simplified the job for Ukraine drone operators, who are always carefully selecting the targets and limiting only to the military targets. Now they know that Russian did the job, and they have they are filtering that this road is using only by the military supplies, which are legitimate targets to bring the Russian gesture of the goodwill in this area one step closer. Hope I answered the question. Back to you, Alan. Back to you, Chuck.
Thank you, WarDoggo. Yes, you did answer the question. And, I just do want to make everyone aware that tens and tens and tens of thousands of Ukrainians have family and friends in occupied Ukraine. So even in Luhansk and Donetsk, in areas that Russia has occupied now into the fifth summer of the war, And it's also a way of reminding folks that although Russia invaded Ukraine in a full-scale genocidal invasion in 2022, it annexed Crimea in 2014 and created these fake people's republics in Luhansk and Donetsk in 2014, where a kind of border war took place with a lot less intensity than the war today. But there have been Ukrainians under occupation for as many as 10 years, and they are among the ones that WarDoggo reminds us are waiting for liberation. Chuck, one other question, and then I also think we just might take a look at one map. I think maybe the map in Kostyantynivka. But one more question about the M-14, this highway that Ukraine has under fire control. A lot of attention is paid to it because it does turn south into Crimea. But I have to assume that this is also the main route of supply and logistics all the way to the left bank of the Dnipro, right? And so this might actually have a faster impact on Russian soldiers stationed on the left bank of the Dnipro. And I will also point out in the village of Oleshki, which is across the Dnipro from Kherson city, in the village of Oleshki, the Russians are creating a humanitarian disaster, having cut off water, electricity, gas, and limiting food to the residents of Oleshki. I mean, there are thousands of people in Oleshki that actually need to be saved.
Yeah, that is exactly what's going on there. So Oleshki is was a southern suburb and sort of dacha satellite town. It's south of Kherson. It's on and adjacent to the Dnipro. But you're right, Alan, that M14 highway turns south into Crimea, but it also is a principal supply route for all of the Russian forces that remain in Kherson Oblast. And as you move west of the M14's southward turn, there's a it's a triangular area bordered in the north by the Dnipro River, which goes out to an estuary, like almost a river delta. The Kinburn Spit, which is just what it sounds like. It's a sandbank, former nature preserve that goes out into the estuary where the Dnipro and the Bug River exit out. And I think that it shows really beyond the Russian brutality, which is, of course, you've got plenty of that on tap. But I think it shows how hard up the Russians are actually getting, right? So there is no food supplies to share. They would almost like you to believe that they capriciously shut off the ample bounty of the produce of Russia. That isn't exactly what's happening. They aren't getting any supplies, and leading up, will this be relevant if Ukraine decides to cross the Dnipro River? Yeah, it really will be relevant. We talked about no diesel fuel available. If you've got a bunch of tanks and no diesel fuel, you might as well park them in front of the VFW, right? Because you're not going to be a tanking in those tanks. One day it's going to happen. It is truly going to happen that Ukraine is going to cross the Dnipro somewhere north or south of Kherson and push south. We often talk about the preconditions. What has to happen before Ukraine can do that? Well, for every Russian listener we have in Kherson Oblast, you are damn lucky that you aren't in Pokrovsk. You're not in Konstantinivka. You're not being sent into Kupiansk to recapture the city you've already captured. But if you're going to stage a river crossing, you want the enemy on the other bank to be as weak and disorganized as possible. So there's a couple ways to do that. You bomb him from the Stone Age into the Gravel Age. You keep it up. You rock him back. You destroy his own logistics and his ability to maneuver. And you can do that by kinetic force and fire and steel. Or you can make sure that if he has a logistics network, it can't carry anything. There's nothing to deliver. So General Hodges and I both look forward to the glorious day that this is going to happen. But Alan, we're seeing a little part of that puzzle drop into place right now.
And let's go back to WarDoggo, Chuck, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Look, I believe for quite a long time, many people in expert circles were mentioning that Ukraine is just wearing out the Russian manpower, and that is not 100% productive in the sense of, yes, defending own lands, but the focus on the mid-range, the tactical level is the focus to destroy Russian supply lines. And those people who support Ukraine and those people who are Ukrainians were saying, wait a bit, you will see much more. And that's actually where it is turning. We see shifting the focus from just, consuming Russian attacking manpower to the strategic, tactical and operative level of wearing out the Russian ability to conduct the war, and this big gesture of the goodwill, quote unquote, to happen, as we already seen in Kyiv, as we already seen in Kherson, and many other areas where Russia had to leave, not because they were asked, not because they were so generous, but because their bottom back part was simply hurting in those times. And that I can assure you, maybe I didn't look to the document myself, but I for sure, know the guy who knows the guy, that this is part of Ukraine's strategic, let's say, military doctrine already, let's say, quite far ago, that has been indoctrinated, and it is exactly in execution. And I would not open now a new land, because that's something that is already available in the media, most probably for a certain time already on public, that Ukraine's ability, and this is probably an easy guess, that Ukraine's ability to limit Russia's let's say, earning, exporting the fossils, Russia's ability on the strategic level to conduct the economy afloat, limiting Russia's ability to use the supply, logistics, and overall the supply chain of the war on the tactical level. And level, actually, yes, continuing the same, let's say, holding the line against, let's say, Russian manpower and wearing out Russia's ability to conduct the operation on the ground. So this three levels where Ukraine has shifted the focus and doing all three at the same time, which we are observing these days. That's the confirmation that it's exactly moving in this direction, and Russians are lucky if they understand that the gesture of the goodwill is just simply on the way, and it's a matter of time. Back to you,
Chuck. Go ahead.
No, I was, my mind was returning to the logistical problems that were, you can measure them in Crimea. And again, because, you're getting direct intelligence feeds from, we are hearing social media complaints, et cetera. you can bet Ukraine is receiving much more timely and important intelligence there. I was looking as WarDoggo was speaking. There's a very strong Ukrainian drone attack forming up right now. It's addressing targets in Crimea, and it's the usual link suspects. The Saki airfield, which is a important outpost for Russian naval aviation, naval facilities in and around Sevastopol, traveling as far as the Kirch Bridge, and as always, Russian air defense systems in Crimea are on the top of the menu. I was also looking at we're just talking about trying to get important materials to the SBU Alpha units. I was looking at some U.S. government studies of what the effect of the SBU Alpha units have been on this war. And they have destroyed over $5 billion worth of Russian equipment. Tanks, vehicles, fuel tankers, infantry fighting vehicles, etc. And close to $5 billion in just one type of Russian air defense system, which is the Pantsir system. And 50% of those have been destroyed by Ukraine. And every day, Russia faces this insurmountable problem of how to replace these air defense systems. And Alan, just this afternoon, Finnish intelligence forces have reported that 80% of the forces that were Russian forces assigned to the Finnish border have been sent to Ukraine. And all of the S-400 systems in the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, which is a Baltic overseas possession of the Russians, that all of the S-400 systems have been moved out of Kaliningrad, basically leaving it defenseless. So this is the level, you're starting to get these puzzle pieces. This is how bad the materiel conditions are for Russia. They are cutting the bone, not the muscle, not the fat anymore. And it's amazing to me that Putin still continues to his utterly unachievable war aims. And we haven't even entered the summer offensive yet, which is going to turn into the October surprise, I think, Alan.
It may well be Putin's final summer offensive. Back to WarDoggo, please.
Speaking about those precious air defense that is being eliminated here and there by Ukraine's combat ready guys, including the Alpha SBU, it opens up the whole possibility of varieties that another drone experts are bringing to Russia as the consequence of the war that they have started in Ukraine. Did you notice how in Russia have changed about the war, and specifically in Moscow area, when the drones start arriving and the suburbs, Moscow suburbs, the fuel stations, and the specific, let's say, oil industry facilities start burning? I personally noticed that they didn't enjoy much when the war have their own lens, and it was not the same even when the war have reached already the areas like Belgorod, like many others that are the frontline neighboring areas. And when it started getting to the big Russian cities, even the national polls that are highly redacted, highly manipulated, they start saying people that don't like the war. You see, at the end, it turns out that you don't like the war when the war returns to your own territories. Who could think, right? And that's exactly part of the strategic doctrine that Ukraine is implementing and executing, in a sense of making the aggressor pay. And in this sense, we are not speaking about only money, economical effect of those, call it kinetic sanctions, but we are speaking even the mindset, the psychological effect of knowing, Kiev in 2-3 days is far there, and now you're going to pay. And here is what's gonna happen. Yeah, that's exactly the thing. Back to you.
Yeah, I think that Putin had a plan to take Kyiv in 2 or 3 days. What he didn't understand, and what the Russians have now learned in the 5th summer of the war, the Ukrainians had a plan too, to defend themselves and defend their sovereignty and defend their hometowns and their families and all of their loved ones over a very long time. And this is why we are seeing Ukraine's strategic war effort against Russian oil refining capacity succeed, because it is a plan designed to succeed over time. Just as defense of Ukraine is a plan designed to succeed over time. And this is why the Russians have now lost, killed, and wounded 1.3 million Russian soldiers. That's still not enough for Putin to call it quits. Putin himself has said he would invest the lives of 2 million Russians in order to reincorporate Ukraine as part of the Russian Empire. Why would he do that? Because he doesn't think there can be a Russian Empire without Ukraine. What he doesn't understand is that Ukraine will never again become a part of anyone's Russian Empire. They are now, and they will forever be, Ukrainians in a sovereign Ukraine. Chuck, we have lots of questions coming in, including this from our friend Smokey, and folks at Volya Radio will have a hint of where we might want to go with a map or two. Smokey wants to look at Kamiansky, and I think this is a great place to look, because it goes back to what WarDoggo was saying about how Ukraine is going to bring together three tactical efforts in this war, quite possibly in Kamiansky, which is to the west of Kyiv. Smokey asks, what are the current estimates regarding the strength of Russian defenses near Kamiansky? And do you have a best guess as to the quantity and readiness of Russian troops there?
Well, thanks, Smokey. Good. That's a great question. And Alan and I began covering Kamiansky again here to orient people where it is on the battlefield. The zero line basically starts in the north, and it makes a sort of eventually almost a 90 to, well, a couple of stair steps, starting about in Konstantinivka, and then it goes east and west for a little bit, goes down to Pokrovsk, goes sort of east and west a little bit, steps down to Huliopole, and then east and west under Kyiv, and goes to Kamiansky, which was once a viable port on the Dnipro reservoir there, which has largely been turned into marshland because of the criminal bombing of the dam complex above Kherson. This is a place where Russia has been pushed back in the last 3 weeks. The gain is somewhere between 50 and 100 square kilometers by Ukraine. And I will get the troop numbers for you, but one of the reasons this Ukrainian effort here is succeeding, it is one of the farthest points in Russian logistics network is strained pretty much to the maximum to reach places like Kamenansky. And then as you go down the Dnipro, things are really quiet until you get to Kherson. So what I'm saying is, one of the things Ukraine is good at doing is, if you're going to go on the offensive, you want to go in a place where the enemy is less disposed to meet your efforts, right? So you're basically, war college talk, you want to hit the enemy where he is weak, hit the enemy where he is not, or hit the enemy in a place where it's going to take him superhuman efforts to meet your attacks there. And what Ukraine has done in Kamenansky, that is to the west of Huliopole, where the Russians have actually been they have taken the town of Huliopole at great cost, and they have pushed west, but they are being pushed back there as well. So if I'm the Russian local brigadier general or major general commanding this section, I've really got to rob Peter to pay Paul. So, you think about this, the Russians are losing one division, 10,000 guys every 10 days. So getting live bodies, however you get them, whether you get them from Nepal, Cuba, sub-Saharan Africa, or the local loony bin in Siberia, now you've got 2 points that are west of Pokrovsk, which is still the central effort. And we're going to see that the Russians aren't going to be able to do that very much longer this summer, Alan. And remember, what's on the Russian dance card for this summer is not holding what they got. They have these ridiculous orders from the Kremlin to advance on all axes. That just doesn't work. To our Russian listening guests, if you tucked your horns in and just dug your fingernails in and tried to hang on to what you got, you might have a chance. But these, you're writing checks your butt can't cash. You are not going to push much. You're not going to make it to Kyiv this summer. You are not going to take Konstantinivka this summer. You're not going to take Kramatorsk. You're not going to take Drushkivka. You're not going to take Liman. You're not going to take any of those places. And I'll just add this up. Well, every time I say one of those cities, let's think of the last troop cost that it cost to take Pokrovsk, close to 250,000 people. So I'll cut you a break. Those 5 cities, I'm going to say through some magic, you're only going to lose 100,000 people taking each city. Alan, that's 500,000 more casualties. Congratulations, Vladimir. You're closing in on 2 million. How's that 72-hour operation going? The big picture for me is the war is no longer winnable by Russia. There's no W. They're not going to pull it out in the fourth quarter. Don't believe me, I'm a naval officer, but you might want to believe General Hodges, right? He's of the same opinion. So I don't think Russia's going to win this war. I haven't thought that for the last 2 years. But Alan, as you and I talked last week and in the past month, I think we're approaching the point where we can say that Russia may actually lose this war. And by that, I mean forces beaten back and pushed back, as we saw in the Kherson offensive, as we saw in the Sumy offensive, and as we saw in the Kharkiv offensive. So is it possible? Well, there's precedent for it.
Well, I think as you trace the route of the M-14 through southern occupied Ukraine and out to the west, everybody can see the fragility of Russian logistics. If Ukraine can break those logistics, then maybe this summer will become known as the summer of the great Ukrainian counteroffensive. Back to WarDoggo.
Yes, this autumn is expected to bring lots of surprises to Russian to Russian occupying forces, just simply because the military golden rule says if you don't have too much luck in the offensive actions and your effort doesn't bring any significant results, wait for the enemy to make the significant efforts that might be even more effective. From the south to the north, and I believe listeners would be also asking about if Russia is able to involve Belarus or use Belarus territory like Russia did in 2022, while Russia being executing the full-scale invasion in the first months and involving the territory of Belarus. Can Russia open an additional part of the front line from the north? And this is one of the interesting thoughts, because in Ukraine's expert environment, and even Ukraine's president mentioned several times in his daily communication with the country, with people, was mentioning it, and it was mentioned depending on Russian level of, let's say, desperate decisions that they would be making while looking for specific spectacular solutions. And we know they're able of different spectacular solutions, like this Oreshnik launch was rather political and not targeting. I mean, physically it was targeting Kiev, it was targeting capital of Ukraine. Same, it was before targeting Lviv, but the message is to the wider audience: look what we can do. That's exactly 100 million spent to devastate the couple of garages, in fact, like literally several garages in Bila Tserkva, or if you translate the name of the town, White Church City. And more desperate they will be going. They will be going for such, let's say, brilliant solutions, like trying to use the military exercises in Belarus as a pretext to build up a certain ability to attack Ukraine from the north. But all the military analysis are that it's not happening at the moment. So not in the matter of weeks, Russia will be able to conduct anything like this. But the pressure on Russia is definitely saying that they would be seeking for some kind of scaring actions. It might not only be an attack on the north of Ukraine, but it could be also some terrorist actions in the European countries, covert or less covert operations in European countries, Baltics, or even Poland, or any other areas that are already widely known. And I believe those countries are also holding hand on pulse what Russia is able to bring as a trouble to their countries. That's just probably to anticipate the question people maybe asking, because that's also widely discussed in the recent days. Bringing back this topic from the archives, calling it like this, knowing that there is going to be the Belarusian exercise quite soon. Back to you.
Yeah. Thank you, WarDoggo. I want to go back to mockers. We'll be thinking about bringing this live simulcast to a conclusion over the next 10 or 15 minutes or so, answering some final questions, giving everybody a little more time to make as generous a donation as possible. Mockers, back to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that Ukraine are, they're sending perhaps a response this evening. We have up to 340 drones, including jet-powered UAVs, and 3 groups of surface vessel drones are claimed to be heading into Russia in various directions, or towards Russia in various directions. And just to note what you were saying earlier, Syrski himself, he's recently, not Syrski, Sikorski, Polish guy. Sorry. He himself said in an interview today, it's the 5th year of war and Putin is still fighting in the Donbass. They're now scared of Ukrainian strikes on Moscow. And I bet not a single person in this room would have predicted that. What an amazing success by Ukraine that Russia is unable to launch an offensive and is now losing territory and more troops it can recruit every month. And he's got a point, hasn't he?
I think he makes the point the Ukrainians have taken, 4.5 years to make, but knowing all along it is a point that they would make. I wish the world would listen harder. I wish the world would watch more and understand what Chuck and WarDoggo and Mockers and all the listeners at Volya Radio, all of our viewers are coming to understand not only that Russia cannot win this war, but Ukraine stands a very good chance to defeat Russia militarily, but only if they receive everything they need to do that. And in a very small way, your donation through the tweets in Volya Radio, you can tap on your donation through indications and warnings will become part of how Ukraine turns the tide on Russia this summer. And even if your donation in your eyes is small, it's not, because if you're giving $10 or $20 or $50 or $100, there are 5, 10, 50, 100 other people who will be joining you and giving the same small donation. That is what we are aiming for at Volya Radio. It is what we are aiming for here at Indications and Warnings. We have had some just wonderful, very generous donations here today. But, we have also had many dozens of donations that have helped us raise a few $1,000s. And, on Volya Radio, on Indications and Warnings, we will get back to you with that final amount raised today to help Alpha SBU with what they really urgently need. Chuck and WarDoggo especially, it's interesting how this conversation on this live broadcast has come around to logistics. It is a noose almost that Ukraine is pulling around the Russian occupiers. And there are a couple of questions about the Kirch Bridge, especially a question about the rail link across the bridge and the rail ferries that Russia has used to bring supplies into Crimea. Chuck, are those still operational?
Well, the answer is, look how critical the M-14 highway is right now. And when Thomas put that map up earlier, you can see there's the direct connection virtually across the Kerch Straits there. But this is a 200 or 300 additional mile journey, as you can see right here. Now, you don't drive trucks that far if the bridge is working. So look, the bridge is standing, but remember the large explosion that busted the bridge decks out. This was what, two and a half, 3 years ago. The critical damage was, just coincidentally with the explosion, there was a fuel train crossing. The Kirch Bridge has 2 road decks, and in the middle it has a rail rail link. Well, the just coincidentally, because there are always coincidences in war, the rail cars carrying fuel at the top of the rail bridge were set on fire. And they burned literally for hours, with one tank car cooking off after another, feeding a fire that was hot enough to melt the spans that are supporting the rail network. Well, since that period, the ability of the Kirch Bridge to sustain rail traffic has diminished. So the trains that are able to cross, they have to go slower, they have to be more lightly loaded, they have to go less often, the track has to be inspected between each train. That made it necessary for the Russians to round up rail car ferries from their far-flung empire, get them into the Sea of Azov, where on the East Bank, they would pick up rail cars that were diverted off the main line across the bridge and loaded onto these ferry vessels and ferried across the Kerch Straits. That is a viable transportation link. I've mentioned it before. For rail traffic in the United States to cross the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, the same thing is done. There is no rail link from Norfolk to Delmarva Peninsula. The coal and fuel oil and everything else that the Russians would transfer gets on these barges, propelled vessels, and they go across the Chesapeake Bay. Well, Ukraine sank, there were 3 of those. Ukraine sank 2 of them. And the last one they sank, they made sure it was in the middle of loading rail cars, so it sank and was scuttled at the rail junction. So in order to even start doing that, you have to salvage the ship. Okay, so now that's why we see that great M-14 detour. But all of that, you could say, and when the history of this war is written, someone is going to say, the sinking of the rail cars and the damage of the Kirch Bridge was one of the first predicants to the Cross-Dnipro offensive. You have to depress the enemy's logistical abilities by whatever means necessary, right? So if you can force them to take their resources and divert them elsewhere, that's great. If you can't diminish the stores they have, the fuel, the ammunition, the vehicles, if you can blow the bridges, and that can be, damaging the Kirch Bridge, or as Alan and I have reported often, just these little culverts on a road somewhere, a little creek that has to cross. You can even damage it. Now tanks can't get across that. Just a little highway overpass. So Ukraine is constantly nibbling at all of these weak points all of the time. And there's a reason the Kirch Bridge is still standing. And that is because on some glorious morning, everybody who is occupying an apartment building, squatting, the colonizers that Russia has sent into Crimea, they're all going to get in their Ladas and they're going to self-evacuate. Right. They're gonna help rid Ukraine of the pests in Crimea. That's the only reason the bridge is still up, Alan.
Yeah, and it's the only reason that it will remain up just long enough so that those Russians can finally leave Crimea. And actually, there was a question: are Russians leaving Crimea? Yes, some are. Some Russians that have been given the opportunity to settle in Ukrainian-owned homes in Crimea have pulled up stakes and they've gone back to Russia. I think what is really significant is that no Russians are taking their summer vacation in Crimea. A couple more questions from the Black Sea, and then we are going to bring this simulcast to a conclusion. I think this is an interesting question, Chuck. Can you see a realistic scenario for a successful big-scale amphibious landing operation on Crimea by Ukrainian forces? Off the top of my head, I would say such an assault would be extraordinarily difficult, especially for the Ukrainians to attempt, but they may not have to. They can literally lay siege to Crimea with drones and maybe force the Russians to abandon Crimea.
Yeah, so if amphibious warfare, not preposterous, not utterly out of the question, but right now, extremely premature. And I've been encouraging people, go to Grok this afternoon and type in brief summary of the battles between the Nazis and the Soviet Union over Crimea during World War II, because the geography hasn't changed and the battles are going to occur. There are still going to be the same salient points, the same highways are up, etc. The Russians were able to stay in the fight in Crimea because they kept launching amphibious things. They would beach freighters on the beach. They didn't really have amphibious assault ships till later in the war, but the Russians kept feeding people in that way. I think when we talk about amphibious landings now as it relates to Crimea, what we should talk about is not Ukrainian capability, which is not matured yet for amphibious cross the beach landings. But what is important is who doesn't have that capability anymore, and it's Russia. And Russia had several amphibious squadrons in the Black Sea, meaning they had landing ship tanks, large landing ships. They had missile corvettes and destroyers and frigates and even a guided missile cruiser to defend those amphibious squadrons. They were able to project power in the Soviet era all over the Black Sea, keep their satellites in compliance, keep their thumb down on everyone they wanted, with tens of thousands of naval infantry troops, everything that goes with an amphibious squadron. Well, those of our Russian Navy listeners, they realize they don't have that capability anymore. Dozens of their landing ships have been sunk, and when we all get to visit the National Underwater Park in the Moskva wreck zone, we also realize that Russia can't project power across the Black Sea anymore. They simply cannot do it. But if they do want to try, and I'd love to see the next admiral who goes in to talk to Putin and tries to talk him out of putting 2,000 Russian naval infantry troops on one landing ship, and they get to eat a Neptune missile. So the good thing is the Russians are not going to be able to use amphibious forces to reinforce a battle when it comes to it on Crimea. And that's an important tool that's been taken out of Putin's tool bag, Alan.
It sure is. That pathetic Black Sea fleet will never, ever leave the Black Sea, not because it wouldn't be allowed as a result of various conventions, the name of which will come to me in a second. But, Putin and succeeding Russian leaders will have to keep that pathetic fleet somewhere in the Black Sea. And boy, wouldn't you hate to be a Russian sailor on board any of those Black Sea ships? Look at Chuck and WarDoggo and Mockers and all of our listeners on Volya Radio at Twitter, all of our viewers at Indications and Warnings here on YouTube. I want to thank all of you for all of your questions, for your attention, for comments I'm seeing that helps me understand you are the ones watching this war. You are the ones that are listening to WarDoggo and to Chuck and to Will Teal over on Volya Radio, to Mockers on Booms and Woes almost every morning on Volya Radio. And you are the ones contributing to help Ukraine defeat Russia. You are the ones contributing to help the Alpha SBU units right now on the front line. I just want to ask all of you, in the last few moments we are live here with this simulcast, find the tweet up in the nest of Twitter of Volya Radio and click on that link here at Indications and Warnings on YouTube. Share the station with your friends or with anyone who wants to know more about how Ukraine is going to defeat Russia militarily. And point out to them there is a live link in the video description that will allow them to make a generous contribution. But I do want to thank you all. I want to go back for a moment to WarDoggo.
Thank you so much for today's discussion. Thanks everyone for the contributions and the support of the proactive fundraiser. All the efforts now go to support the Alpha SBU guys. Gerza team heard today with us. I think discussing with Gerza in parallel as he was coming up also to say things in the back channel, we might end up doing such sessions on the regular basis. I believe audience I would really love the insight from on the ground from the most combat ready guys like Alpha SBU and Alpha SBU of Security Service of Ukraine, the Special Operations Center A, as they call themselves, are definitely the guys worth to support, and we have this. We are honored to have this trust to bring the stuff that guys need to be more effective in protecting the Ukrainian peaceful skies and making the enemy leave in so-called gestures of the goodwill. That's very important. Thanks everyone for all the contributions today. For those who'd be listening the episode in record, just simply hitting in the browser gitbutter.com and then / proactive. That's exactly how you can get easy and straightforward to the donations are coming live. You can see your donation being registered immediately as you press the button to donate. You can wrap your donation in some nice words that guys would be reading for sure, and you can choose if it is one-time donation or it is a monthly support that helps to plan the things up front. And yes, we will hear more from the guys, sometimes even saying thank you or thank you for service means a lot for people who are in a daily quite challenging conditions, losing the combat brothers and who since many years become already family members, being in the same for many years. Despite that, Ukraine holds the line. Ukraine have set the strategic goal to make the Russians leave Ukraine, and remembering for the ages that behind their western border, the dragons live there. I love the expression, as our friends, the coding troll, have said once. They have to remember for centuries that the dragons live there, and they have not even think about making anything similar in the future. But that's still to come. For the moment, we have to support the guys who hold our peaceful skies, and the combat for democracy is these days happening in Ukraine. And we not only to observe, but to be active supporters of those who are able to hold the line in Ukraine. In this Memorial weekend in front of the Memorial Day, I would like to wish everyone calm days and remembering all of those who have given the most pressures that the human can have, life, for something that it is even more in the priority, which is freedom. Because if you think that if life is more important than freedom, let's think about those people in Ukraine who, with weapon in their hands, defending own freedom, because we know, not in wars, what happens when Russia comes and you lose the freedom. That's exactly the fight for existence and for freedom that is happening in Ukraine, and we are part of those who are in the side of light, in the side of good, and against that evil that came unwanted. Back to you. Thank you so much again for having us today, and thank you for such an amazing episode that is giving so much context about Ukraine. And I'm very grateful that this episodes about Ukraine are happening, because there are not much things you can find today in regular media about Ukraine, in the regular news, and many people still keep supporting Ukraine, knowing that is important. Thank you once again. Back to you.
Thank you, WarDoggo, and thank you for bringing us full circle back to, for American listeners, this Memorial Day here in the United States. You know, here on Indications and Warnings, subscribe, give us a like, share. When you do that, you will help build a bigger audience to hear the voices of WarDoggo and Gerza and Andriy, of April Huget, the medic from Ukraine, of so many other Ukrainian voices that we need to hear and acknowledge every single day. It means that you will bring more people here to Indications and Warnings, where they can find a link that allows them to take action. It's givebutter.com/proactive. You can help WarDoggo right there. Chuck, back to you.
Yeah, we were just talking about, what does the world think of all of this? You know, some media outlets said from the beginning that this war wasn't going to last more than 72 hours. I'll remind everybody that, look, in the first quarter of this game, it was Ukraine that undertook negotiations with Russia. I think Putin probably rused the day that he didn't take the solution that was offered to him then, which frankly would have been a very bitter pill for Ukraine to swallow. But the media that sold you that now chooses to completely ignore a conflict that has gone exactly the opposite of the way they told you it was going to go. Are they ignoring Ukraine? Well, I'm looking at you, BBC. If you went to the BBC homepage, it used to say Latin America, Africa, Asia, Europe, Gaza, and war in Ukraine. Well, they don't even cover the war in Ukraine anymore, Alan. They simply ignore it. There may be a report on last night's attack and some of the more egregious things that happened in Ukraine, but there no longer is a dedicated, editorially curated section on covering the war in Ukraine. And we're talking to the choir here, actually. But we're in the information fight. We're bringing you what's actually happening in the war. WarDoggo's been reporting on this for the last pretty much 5 years. Alan and I have been working together for at least 4.5. We'll bring you the good and the bad. We're going to report the lumps and we're going to report the successes. But studying war was one of my jobs. I'm telling you folks, the military objectives that Moscow has are no longer achievable in this war. They don't have the material, they don't have the leadership, they don't have the training, and they're running out of the equipment and the fuel. And we're seeing again right now, as Mockers just reported, there are massive drone attacks outgoing right now towards Russian targets. A significant portion of them are heading into the Moscow area. And again, where they will address military and economic targets. This is not a firebombing in return for a cruise missile attack. But anyway, want to thank you very much for sharing your time with us. We appreciate it. Alan and I always say we want to help you win your information microcosm. You're at the barbecue this weekend. You're having a beer with that brother-in-law you don't like, and he's telling you that Russia's going to win this. I want you to say, look, you should call Chuck Farr up because he wants to talk to you. But thank you, everybody. WarDoggo, thank you so much for joining us. Mockers, love you. All the people at Volya Radio. And Alan, my buddy, I'm always here with you, man. Anytime.
Well, thank you, everyone, for giving up some of your Memorial Day weekend. Thank you, Volya Radio, for this great collaboration. Thank you to all of our listeners and viewers. Boy, this has been a great show. Someone said it would go on for 72 hours because I'm the co-host. But no, it's only been 3. So to everyone, a safe and memorable Memorial Day weekend. Mockers.
Yeah, I want to come in here and say thank you to everybody who joined me in making donations today. And you don't have to not make donations just because we're not here reminding you. WarDoggo is consistently raising money in his proactive fund to help Alpha, and anybody else who comes to him, to ask for assistance. But mainly, we are supporting one of the most elite units, and the work that they do is reported on regularly, so you can quite clearly see where your money's going. And thank you all for coming. So love yous, mean it. And I'm going to bed now so I can report on all those explosions in the morning.
Slava Ukraini.
Heroim Slava. Thank you, everybody.
Slava Nazi.